and this is now the occasion to open the floor for a brief Q&A session. Just raise your hand, short questions, you will get short answers. Okay, I'll start from, who's going to be the second? Difficult to get the first. Yes, please. I don't know, do we have microphones around here? We don't, so you need to speak up, please. We do? But then we need to move. Okay, since it is recorded, please identify yourself, brief question.
Donald Balaban, the question is for Abby Joseph Cohen, and it regards a distinction between the political economics and partisan politics, and a comment that your comments on the issue of the percent of the GDP that is now represented by the government rather than private enterprise, and the fact that the government employees in the United States, by many indicators, have increased relative to the private sector, and the impact on some of the comments that you made. I wondered if you'd address that issue.
Abby, 1 second. Thank you very much. Let me cluster several comments together. Thank you. Microphone over there. Please identify yourself.
I would like to ask a question of the our French expert on the euro, which we see front page news on almost every single day, and what the outlook is, considering what's been going on in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else while we are collecting? Yes, number 3, please.
I am Aurel Weiner from Romania. A short question to Mr. Jacques Attali. I am very happy to meet him. I read many things with his signature, and it was wonderful as we heard. But I want to be more exactly. What is your prevision about Eurozone after the election, recently election from Greece? Will be Greece in Eurozone or not? Thank you very much.
So let's stop here. We will go, if we have time for a second round, we will go to it. Okay, last one at this stage.
I'd like to know, I actually believe that...
Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry, Barry Sobel. Most of the volatility today in the sovereign debt markets is due to leverage and credit derivatives. And credit derivatives originally created to hedge exposure to corporate debt, things of that nature. Do we believe that for many years sovereigns were allowed to exist on balance sheets and there was never any problems? But now with credit derivatives, it seems that there are many people profiting at the expense of the countries, which in turn is at the expense of the country's people.
Thank you very much. Let's stop here with this phase. You can think about other questions depending on how expensive will be the answer. So let's try to have relatively brief answers. Abby, you first, and then Jacques, and anyone else who wants to jump in. Please.
Let me begin, thank you. Let me begin in general by saying there were a number of questions that relate to U.S. government policy. And let me state the obvious, and that is, as has been mentioned at other times in this conference, there's a real cost to being passive. And one of the very big differences between the U.S. approach to this crisis and the European approach has been the level of activity. I not surprisingly disagree with some of the simplistic conclusions that Jacques presented before in terms of the origins of the crisis. So for example, I am hard put to see how the United States is responsible for the current problems in Greece. By just one. But let's go back to a point that Yair made, which I think is correct, and that is the fact that there was so much liquidity and interest rates were so low around the world for so long for so many borrowers was in fact the basic cause of the financial crisis around the world. When interest rates are too low and liquidity is so easily available, that liquidity is wasted. Bad decisions are made, and whether that was in the home mortgage market in the United States or whether that was in the sovereign market in Greece, I think that there is that commonality. And so one of the interesting things to talk about is the way government policy responded thereafter. Before the crisis ended, before the Great Recession ended in the United States, the bank regulators subjected the banks that still existed in the U.S. to what was a very difficult so-called stress test. They put forth a pretty ugly scenario for the equity markets, a pretty ugly scenario for the economy, and they said, what is the balance sheet strength of these institutions? And then they repeated the process not that long ago. But when they did it in 2009, they basically said to every bank, you will delever your balance sheets, you will increase your reserves, you will make yourselves safer institutions. Europe waited 12 to 18 months to do that. And in the most recent round of stress tests, every U.S. bank, shall we say, passed, and a number of the largest U.S. banks were very far along, not just in terms of the current capital requirements, but the ones that will be imposed 3, 4, and 5 years from now. In Europe, what we found is that some of the largest institutions have double the leverage of the U.S. banks. So the U.S. banks, in response to supervision and in response to just better management, have reduced their own risks. But there is this outstanding question which we must address, and that is we have an area of fiscal policy in the United States which has not been well handled. And let's recognize, and I'm oversimplifying in the interest of time, that there are really two different issues. In addition to state and local versus the federal government, there's also short-term versus long-term. The long-term, to me, is the problem. It is the aging of the baby boom generation. The peak of the baby boom, 1957, add 65 years, that's 2022, and then we run into a situation of our Social Security system. It's probably funded okay, but the post-retiree healthcare system is not. And that is really the budget deficits that we need to be most concerned about. The short-term budget deficit that we're now dealing with is much more related to the stresses of the severe recession from which we are emerging, and also, of course, shall we say, bad stewardship in recent years. If you look at the data from the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, what you basically see is that if economic growth in the United States continues and picks up just a little bit, we will in fact see a reduction in our deficit and a pretty notable drop in terms of deficit per GDP. Not right away, but over the course of the next two to 3 years. I'm going to go back to my very first comment earlier, and that is, let's talk about political economy. Will our politicians focus on policy and less on the politics? To be facing the big decisions we are in terms of deficit reduction, not just in the short term, but the long term, and to be doing it in an election year is not a good recipe. And we all found out a year ago what happens when the two parties cannot compromise, when people in various positions say you can't have compromise, you either win or you lose. That in the U.S. political system is obviously a very bad outcome for the whole economy. We saw that last summer, and what we're hearing in Washington is that nobody wants to be responsible for that again this summer. That doesn't mean they'll solve the problem. I think it means that they'll wait until 2013 before they address it.
Thank you very much. Jacques Attali, please.
First, just for the fun of a conversation and the question of is the U.S. responsible for a Greece situation, my answer is seriously yes. Because if there was not a crisis in the U.S., if all the Americans and the European leaders have not mismanaged by crisis by increasing their debt, I remember you the public debt of Europe is 83% of GDP, the public debt of US is 103% of GDP. If all of them have not mismanaged by increasing debt, as you said, by excess leverage, then European nations will not have been up to a certain threshold which was manageable. Greece was fairly manageable before the crisis in terms of level of debt. The fact that they entered into that crazy situation led to that. I would add, just for the fun of it, that if we take the American ratio and just look at the ratio, not the size, and if you put this country, US, as a member of a European nation, it will be right between Italy and Greece. Then I think it's very important that in this room and in the US, people realize that the situation in the US is a catastrophe for US and for the world. That the denial of reality by the US in terms of budget deficit, in terms of balance of payment, is a catastrophe for the world. We need politicians in the US who take strong decisions, not to believe that growth can be sustainable with such a huge amount of budget and balance of payment deficit. It's not only good for the rest of the world, it is important for us, but it is fundamental for the US, and we all in Israel and Europe and a lot of other countries, we need strong and stable democracy in the US. And that's not the route that the Americans are taking now. As far as the question of the survival of the Eurozone, I think I answered. The most probable scenario, if nothing serious happens, is that the euro will disappear as a currency. Because Greece has done tremendous efforts. I would say mainly the poor in Greece has done tremendous efforts, amazing efforts. And even vote, and we could applaud them for more efforts. It's amazing. They have done more efforts even than the Germans have done in the last 10 years. Huge efforts of reforms. Spanish people are still doing enormous efforts. The problem is that because of the huge amount of new debt that come from the crisis, they need to be more and more efforts, and what is needed is time, and for that they need to have a global instrument for growth at the central level, like the US. I mean, what will happen to California if it was not a central government? California is bankrupt, more than Greece, more than Spain. Then we in Europe need simply to realize that we need a federal state to compensate the differences between the state and the different states of Europe, and the difference between Greece and northern part of Italy or some part of Germany is not higher. The differences between some part of Alabama or Appalachians and some part of Silicon Valley, it's the same kind of differences. You have in the US a federal state, we don't have that. If we don't put that in place in the next, my bet is 1 year, then the euro will be in bad position. If we don't do that in the last months, I think the central bank can do something. Because after all, the first mandate of a European central bank is to survive as a central bank. And if the politicians don't act, already the central bank has done two things, what is called LTRO, which is quantitative easing, to be short. Already just to survive. If they have not done that, the euro will have already disappeared December 23rd. I'm sure that the central bank can do more. There's still a room of maneuver, but it's only a way for the central bank to say to the politicians, please decide something. We can only give you time, nothing more.
Thank you very much. Getting close to the end of this session. I must say that we had a lot of views, which means that we have a lot still on our agenda, but I'm not sure whether you come out of here more or less concerned than what you were when you came in. And it is a serious reflection, because the last remark of Jacques Attali told us that there is a way out. And if you did not hear the content, you would have been optimistic. But then when he told you what has to be done, and maybe even within a relatively short period of time in historical context, then you wonder, is it feasible to have this practically a federalism within Europe? Henry Kissinger once said in a different context that you do not create a new world political order as an emergency measure. And in analogy, We are now in an emergency situation where things are very, very fragile. Is this the most conducive environment for a new order? Or is this the time to take a pause and whatever it means, it means? You know, there is a very famous story that Jean-Claude Trichet keeps telling that he had to face, that how do you go from here to there? And the guy who was lost in the middle of London asking somebody, how do I drive from here to Dublin? And he was told, I really don't know, but I would definitely not start from here. But we are where we are, which is the challenge for policies. We are where we are. And the dream really originated many years ago. And as somebody said, if you want your dreams to come true, you better wake up first. And maybe it is a wake-up call. And maybe things are not sufficiently in crisis for everyone to bring about a new beginning. But that means that we have an agenda for our next conference, which is tomorrow in a generic sense. So let me thank all of our speakers. We just arrived by soft landing to 1 p.m. Thank you very much, and thank you for the audience.